Fisher.
Thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise in support of the Broadcasting Services Amendment Community Radio Bill of 2022. Now, it's been said that community broadcasting is a thing of the past, that commercial radio, podcasting and music streaming services have filled the gap. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't mind listening to Sam and Ash on Hot 91.1 or Todd and Sammy on 92.7 Mix FM. In fact, I love Todd and Sammy. All those four guys are fantastic and they do a great job for our local community. And I use all sorts of streaming platforms like News Radio. Wish News Radio had fixed their platform though, because sometimes it's a little bit dodgy. And of course, although I need to be careful about owning up to the fact that I use the ABC streaming service on this side of the House, but it's true, I do, Mr Deputy Speaker. Now, but I'm here to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that community broadcasting on the Sunshine Coast isn't just carrying on, it is absolutely thriving. Now, the main community radio on the Sunshine Coast, I know you'll never get the name correct, Mr Deputy Speaker, but it is Sunshine FM. And this is a terrific radio station, and in fact it is, many on the Sunshine Coast don't know this, but it is the #1 radio station on the Sunshine Coast by listenership. It's not a commercial broadcaster, it's not the ABC, it's not Triple J or Double J or anything like that. It's a community broadcaster. Sunshine FM takes about 35% of the radio audience on the Sunshine Coast, despite a narrow target market of what they describe as more mature folks like perhaps you and me, Mr Deputy Speaker. They're reaching 40% of listeners over 40 and 52% of listeners over 65. They attract 10% more than the best performing commercial broadcaster and almost 300% more than the ABC Sunshine Coast. And that number has only grown despite the resourcing, personnel and broadcast consumption challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Sunshine FM is the only community broadcaster reaching numbers into 6 digits across the region. I want to give a big shout out to Chris Wordsworth, who is one of the executives there, and Linda Prout, who's on in the mornings, and Trevor Young. Now, Linda Prout, has she got a voice for radio, Mr Deputy Speaker? Whenever I speak to her, and it is regularly, I often comment that she has just got the best voice for radio, and I always like to pump her tyres up a little bit. I want to pay tribute to them for their hard work, for their tenacity and their passion for the Sunshine Coast, and also they play great music as well. When you add the other community broadcasters to the mix, and we have a lot of Christian community radio stations on the Sunshine Coast. They broadcast to, in fact, a lot of not just southeast Queensland, but to the Pacific from the Sunshine Coast. But when you add all those up, those community radio stations, they account for 46% of the total radio broadcast market. 46%. And in speaking to this bill, I want to reflect on the vital role played by Sunshine FM and the various other community broadcasters on the Sunshine Coast. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, community broadcasters have long raised concerns with the approach of the Australian Communications and Media Authority in their granting of licences and their management of compliance and assessment. As a result of these changes, community radio broadcasters will enjoy more certainty around what is required of them, and existing broadcasters will be supported with a clearer, more flexible and more streamlined renewal process. One of the biggest frustrations for broadcasters is that each time they're required to renew their licence, they are essentially treated as new applicants. This fails to reflect their hard work and years of community service. It also adds an excessive and unnecessary burden to largely volunteer organisations whose personnel and resources are more often than not stretched as they are. Mr Deputy Speaker, broadcasters have also raised concerns with ACMA's uneven and unclear approach to licensing, compliance and assessment. While the existing legislation gives some direction, it is in no way exhaustive or prescriptive. This bill replaces the old provisions for the refusal of renewal applications for a community broadcasting licence with a provision that is far clearer about that discretion vested in ACMA. Under the new provision, ACMA will retain its ability, when considering applications for CBL renewals, to consider six key criteria. First one is to the extent to which the service would meet the existing and perceived future needs of the community within the licence area of the proposed licence. The second key criteria is the nature and diversity of the interests of that community and the extent to which the proposed service or services would provide material of local significance. The third is the nature and diversity of other broadcasting services available within that licence area. The fourth key criteria is the capacity of the applicant to provide the proposed service or services. And fifth, the concentration of licences or control of multiple licences in one person or service. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, the sixth key criteria, and I know that there's been a change of Deputy Speaker because you wanted to come in and listen to this speech about community radio, and as well you should.
Specifically asked for this roster.
The sixth key criteria is the undesirability of the Commonwealth, a state or a territory, or a political party being in a position to exercise control of a community broadcasting licence. Mr Deputy Speaker, these criteria aim to ensure that community broadcasting reflects the needs and wants of the local community. Like any other registered organisation or not-for-profit, it also requires services to demonstrate their impartiality and independence, their utility and uniqueness, and their capacity to deliver. It also makes clear that the process is not commercial and competitive in nature, but rather aimed at supporting broadcasters whose work and content supports and serves the community in which they operate. The bill goes some way to addressing the frustration many community broadcasters have in meeting often complex compliance obligations without the resources of commercial stations. Bearing in mind, Mr Deputy Speaker, that many of these community radio stations are staffed almost entirely or very significantly by volunteers. Now, currently, when allocating new licences, the date of allocation is the date on which ACMA has irrevocably decided to allocate the licence. I repeat, irrevocably. There is no room for change. It's a burden imposed on organisations without the resources and staff of commercial broadcasters. It means that broadcasters who may have very limited advance notice to prepare their station for broadcast lose out on the use of their broadcasting spectrum, reducing the effective duration of their licence at their own cost. This bill aims to change that. It allows successful licensees to work with ACMA to plan and make necessary arrangements for broadcasting before their licence comes into effect. This is about ACMA as a regulator, partnering with the community broadcasting sector instead of penalising without regard for the shifting nature of volunteer and community engagement. Under the new provisions, licensees seeking a renewal of their community broadcasting licence may now, may now, in exceptional circumstances, lodge late applications for renewal before their current licence expires. By removing the automatic refusal and allowing for some leniency, these community-run radio broadcasters have a little bit of wriggle room to meet their obligations, seek additional support and assess their capacity at the time of renewal without losing 5 or more years of hard work. Our volunteer organisations, particularly in regional Queensland seats like mine and yours, face constant volunteer shortages, transient teams and high rates of turnover. It's hard enough to get someone to come and work for money at the moment, Mr Deputy Speaker, let alone to get them to come and volunteer. By granting this little bit of grace, we can give them a fair go when they may need it most. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, in conclusion, these changes may not seem terribly significant to the vast majority of us in this place, but to the thousands of Australians across the country who volunteer and work in community broadcasting, but more particularly to the people, the thousands, in fact millions of Australians who rely upon community broadcasting for their music, for their news. This is just so very, very important. This bill could mean the difference between their station existing in 5 years or not at all. And to the millions of Australians who listen to community radio, including the roughly 149,000 on the Sunshine Coast, this bill ensures that they'll have access to good music and local content for many years to come. And I commend the bill to the House.